I'm Jason Eastwood. Welcome back to part 2 of Reembracing Our Musical Humanity. We are all born musicians, brought to you by the Historical Museum of St. James-Assiniboia. As we talked about in part 1, for the last thousands of years, millennium, we've been making our music ourselves. Basically in small regional areas, music was a community exercise, a community activity. But about 70 years ago, we saw the beginning of the music industry. Actually, a little before that. It goes back to the late 1800s, and we're going to discuss that in part 2, and how over this time period, we kind of became passive listeners rather than the active participators in making our own musical lives. So we're going to get started in a second, and we're going to learn how the music industry began. Everything has rhythm. In the 1700s and 1800s, music was mostly just played in the home by amateurs. Just families and communities sitting around together and singing songs and playing instruments, sharing the stories of their lives in song. But in the mid-1800s, there became some opportunities to mass market music. Now that's mass market in quotes, because it's the beginning of what we now know as the music industry. See, certain songs had become really popular regionally, and then some business-minded people in the United States, called publishers, decided there was a lot of value in sharing music and started printing sheet music and popular songs that they could sell across the country. Let's go look at some demonstrations of this sheet music. Hello! Hi there, we just got ourselves our first piano, but we don't have any songs to play on it. We heard that you over there at Tin Pan Alley might have some sheet music we can play. Oh, you do? And a sheet music salesperson's coming through town next week. That would be great. Thanks, see you then. See, around the time that this phone became popular, pianos actually became popular. And folks would get pianos in their house and they had no music to play on it because, of course, there's nothing to listen to, so they needed sheet music. And this was the beginning of the music industry because there was a group on a place called Tin Pan Alley, it was called, in New York City. And they went around and got all the popular songs from all the regions around the United States and would write out the music in notes just like this. So you had your melody and your lyrics, and you could buy this sheet music and play it on your own piano in your very own home. So you can see this is what this song is called, The Pickaninny Band, words by Willis N. Bugbee, and music by Thoss B. Weaver. So very particular names back then. We also had a price of 35 cents. So that the person would come around with some sheet music in a suitcase, bring it to the house, you pick some songs you'd like, and put them on the piano and play them. They were able to sell thousands and thousands of copies of sheet music to the musically literate public of these hit songs to be played at home on their pianos. The constant production of new songs that could capture the public's attention became a booming model for publishers and songwriters. The 20th century expanded this model of mass distribution, and something called ballroom dancing became all the rage in the 1910s. There became a larger and larger demand for dance band and published arrangements, much like this, but for a big band, became very popular. The band business became a huge market between World War I and World War II. At the same time, the technology for recording performances onto a record became better and better, and more purchased record players and albums. This was yet another source of opportunity for publishers, artists, writers, and record companies to earn money from music. Let's take a look at what a record is. After sheet music, we finally got into recording sound because these came out, something called records. They were called records because they would make a record of a live sound performance. So for instance, I sit down with my guitar, I sing you a song. As that's happening, one of these discs, they're made of vinyl, you've probably seen, are on the machine, which had a needle go around and imprint the groove of the sound wave of the music coming at it. So then you could take this home, put it on your record player, and play the record, and the sound would come out the speaker, and you'd have that exact live performance you could play and listen to over and over. So that was the beginning of how we could sell recorded sound. And we all started buying music because we could now fill our homes with the music from around the world. And of course, these records, also called vinyl or LPs, became more and more elaborate. The great thing is that they could come with lots of album art. You could open them up, have the band pictures of inside. So what you do is you sit down and you put on the record, you get it out, the sleeve and all the lyrics on it. You take out this record and you put it on the record player, and wow, you're there with the band in your living room. So now that had Canadians buying records in droves and record players. So all of a sudden, instead of playing music on a Friday night, get the family together and they'd all sing songs, they'd sit around the record player and listen to songs. So everyone started to buy the same records, and it really brought the communities across the country, across Canada together, because somebody in Prince Edward Island could be listening to the same song as somebody in British Columbia. But even better, there became something that was free on the air. And this was the history of listening, went into a little thing we call radio. Next we'll talk about radio. This is a radio. And when it came to Canada in the 1920s, the companies that made these radios started broadcast networks because they needed content to be heard on the radio. After all, you can't sell radios if there's nothing to be broadcast. At first, the programming was free, but radio producers soon realized they had sold nearly everyone a radio, and they needed a way to generate a new stream of money or revenue. And there entered the advertising model, which has supported radio and now TV for generations now. In the 21st century, today, it also provides the model for streaming services like Apple Music and Spotify and YouTube, along with a subscription model. See, radio not only paid artists to perform live. Back then, playing a record or a recording on the air was unheard of at first. It served as a marketing tool for new songs, new musicals, and for performers' live appearances. It was the first time that Canadian audiences could simultaneously all connect to the same new songs and artists at the same time. In the 1930s, the recording industry dipped with the Great Depression as Canadians began to favor radio since it was free. They weren't buying those records anymore. Then in the late 30s, as Canada started to come out of the Depression, the advent of swing music drove young people to buy records again. After World War II in 1945, the dance band business began to fade as soldiers and their sweethearts settled down into home life, much like we still live today. In the early 50s, the boom in television set ownership offered a new medium for music. The record industry boomed again with increased prosperity and television variety shows. with performances by new musical artists, especially those playing rock and roll, which young people were crazy for. And these served as marketing fuel for the record industry's success. Radio eliminated live performances and started simply playing recordings, records. The nature of rock and roll music also helped to change the music industry. Previously, songs were written by composers and performed by performers. So one person wrote the song, and then the performer would learn it and go perform it live. But rock and roll, more often than not, combined the two into one. Since these artists were under contract with the record companies, this gave the record companies increased power as compared to publishers who did sheet music before. Additionally, 30 years of radio had created a largely musically illiterate public. The death of the amateur musician meant fewer sales of sheet music, feeding the record industry's rise and publishing's decline. So records became popular and sheet music not so much anymore. People didn't play their own music anymore. And see, rock and roll, with the emergence of artists you might have heard of like Ronnie Hawkins, a great Canadian, or Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Elvis Presley, they were performing this rock music, which was a new form of music, where the performer also wrote all the songs and became what we know as a rock star today. And because people were always listening to professionally produced music on the radio and on these records they would buy, they stopped playing music as much on their own and just listened to the radio or a record. This is when music became more of a spectator sport, as I was talking about in part one. Instead of families and friends sitting around and singing songs and playing instruments together, they would sit in front of the radio or television or the record player and just be passively entertained. With the record company's newfound power to shape the industry and make or break artists, or rock stars, it became the corporate giant that we think of that reached its peak in the 1980s. The great disadvantage of this model was a lot of middlemen got to decide what the public would hear. Music was more often sold on image than artistic quality, and the largely musically illiterate public was none the wiser. So the way it worked was a record executive, some old gentleman usually with a cigar in the 60s and 50s, would decide on who the great artists were and put those music artists out on record. So they would kind of be the gatekeepers or decide what we would listen to. But now, thanks to the internet, you can now do everything that the record companies did by yourself and get your music out directly to the people who love it. But more on that in part 3 of this series, when we learn how to make and put out your own music, so you become your own record company. As far as the way that people listen to music, the cassette tape took over from the vinyl LP and the record, as we talked about, around 1980. Cassettes were smaller and more compact and more sturdy. It was easier to sell and easier to keep too. Let me show you an example of what a cassette looks like. In the 1980s, at least the first half, records kind of became out of favor. And we had the cassette tape as our medium for purchasing music. Now the cassette was nice and compact, and we had these stereo systems called boom boxes. We'd use, you put the cassette in, play one side, then you switch it over and play the other. And it was a great, easy way to take your music on the road. After the cassette tape, we had Walkmans. There's a thing called the Sony Walkman, which you could carry your music around for the first time in history. Now, the problem with the cassettes was they were very unstable. A lot of times what would happen is the tape would unravel. I'll show you an example here, where all of a sudden the tape starts all coming out. And you play it for a while because the gears in the players would wear out. So then you have to get a pencil and wind it back up. easily fixed. But the problem was that the tape would wear out, so they were only good for so long, because after a while, if you left a cassette, for instance, in your car, played it 100 times, the audio quality would degrade quite a bit. The 1990s marked the beginning of the end for the big record companies. But first, they made record profits by introducing a new way to listen to music with the invention of the compact disc. CDs first came out in 1986, and soon the record companies would make billions of dollars by reselling all the old music that was first put out on records and tapes on CDs. Let's take a look at a CD. This is a compact disc, or a CD, as we know it today. CDs were a little like a record. They were a disc, but on the back you had this clear finish that was read by a laser and would translate the music through the speakers. So this was the last physical form of music that would go to a store and buy before streaming and digital files. And the reason that digital files first became so popular is because we could share them for free. And the record companies had really started gouging the prices, which that gouging means turned up the prices a lot on the consumer. These CDs would cost maybe a couple dollars to make, and they would sell them for $20. Of course, the artist needs to get some money, but before CDs, tapes were only $10 each. Now, as you can see by the price tag, even on this one still, they were $20. So people got tired of paying for these CDs and eventually started copying the music to their computers, and when the internet came around, sharing them with their friends. Following the CD was the MP3, followed quickly by sharing sites like Napster, which allowed people to share recordings quickly and easily without spending a dime. Legal action worked to shut sharing sites down, but not before the MP3 became the standard way of listening to music. Apple, seeing this trend, launched iTunes in 2001, a way of legally purchasing and downloading MP3s. Now, today, instead of a music industry, we have Spotify and Apple Music and SoundCloud and lots of streaming sites where we can find almost any song that's ever been recorded for free. But the great news is we can also upload our own music. We can connect with people who might like to listen to something we produce as music, as well as find the people who are making music today and uploading their music to the internet and listen to their music. And if it connects with us, we can actually get to know that person and support them personally. So this is a whole new way to do music after the last 70 years of the music industry we're talking about, where we make our own music and we collaborate with people on the internet, and we pick the music we like instead of a record company saying, listen to this, listen to that. We can go and search the internet and find stuff that really makes a difference in our lives. So in part 3, we're going to talk about the ways that you can become the rock star in your own life and start making your own music with your friends and your community or by yourself and sharing it with the world. So we'll see you then. Until then, I'm Jason Eastwood, and thanks for tuning in.